Welcome back to the Dorian Finance Podcast, where we discuss finance, business, and much more. This episode's topic is the presidential election, where it looks like it's going to be President Trump versus President Joe Biden. I'm going to just break it down. I'm your host, Dorian, and I'm thrilled to be your guide on your path to financial freedom. Let's get started right by you following the podcast. It's not what you do that makes you rich, but how you do it that makes you rich.
A good U.S. president should prioritize leadership, economy stability, national security, diplomatic and international relations, social justice, healthcare, education improvement, infrastructure development, collaboration with Congress for bipartisan solutions. Notice how I didn't talk about their personalities or their mental capability or their physical capability, when you can argue that both of them aren't the sharpest tools in the tool shed, both physically and mentally. And being U.S. president is not about being likable. It's not someone that you want to have a beer with or have dinner with, but can they do a good job in these 9 categories? Are they going to continue to do a good job in the election? Not just for themselves or for special interests, but for the majority of Americans. For sake of time for this podcast, I'm not going to go into every single detail in all 9 categories. I'm going to highlight the ones that stood out to me in each of the categories of their successes. First category is leadership. Trump is unfiltered, off the cuff, and more me-centric leadership style, and he's not afraid to, if someone does a bad job, to blast them. Now, Joe Biden's style is more interpersonal leadership style, emphasizing teamwork. Before we get to the economy stability, I'm going to state a lot of percentages and numbers, and it really becomes easier to compare the two using the table that has both President Trump and President Biden side by side in all these categories, so you can actually see what's what. Economy stability. Starting with President Joe Biden, the gross domestic product, GDP, grew by 2.6%. The unemployment rate was 3.5%. Inflation rate was 5%. Poverty rate was 12.8%. Real disposable income per capita was $46,682. Disposable income per capita adjusted for inflation was $46,557. Moving on to President Donald Trump. The gross domestic product GDP grew by 2.6%, same as President Biden. The unemployment rate was 6.4%. The inflation rate was 1.4%. Poverty rate was 11.9%. Real domestic income per capita was $48,286, a little bit more than President Joe Biden's. Disposable income per capita adjusted for inflation was $48,286. Moving on to category number 3, national security, starting with President Trump, rebuilding the U.S. military with a $2.2 trillion defense spending, including $738 billion for 2020, and secured the largest pay raise for our troops in a decade. National security also encompasses immigration and border control. President Trump emphasizes a strong border, including a border wall around Mexico. President Trump also became the first president leader since Ronald Reagan not to start a war, or more specifically, not to have a war started during their presidency. Now moving on to President Biden. Withdraw from Afghanistan. The 2 wars started, the Ukraine versus Russia and Israel versus Hamas. Illegal immigration doubled under Joe Biden's watch. Moving on to category number 4, diplomacy and international relations, starting with President Biden, which President Biden sought to strengthen their traditional alliances such as NATO and engaging in collaborating efforts with international partners to address global challenges such as climate change and the Paris Agreement, signing that back into place after Trump basically removed the US from the Paris Agreement. Iran nuclear deal negotiations. The goal was to address the concern related to Iran's nuclear program and bringing the country back into compliance with the agreement. Moving on to President Trump. First is the America First policy was a center theme of his approach to international relations, which is basically what's in it for America. America must win in all negotiations. Then he dealt with North Korea's diplomacy. President Trump engaged in dialogue and efforts with North Korea, meeting with North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un in a series of summits. The Middle East peace agreements. The Trump administration played a role in brokering normalizing agreements between Israel and several Arab nations, known as the Abraham Accords, withdrawing from international agreements such as the Paris Agreement that we talked about on climate change, the Iran nuclear deal as well. Moving on to category number 5, social justice, starting with President Joe Biden. First, the executive orders that President Biden signed into law aim to promote racial equality and address the systematic racism, and then also diversity in government appointments. President Biden emphasizes diversity in his appointments to key positions within the administration. Moving on to President Trump, dealing with racial tensions and response to protesters. First one was his response to George Floyd's death, which was to have the investigation speedy and thorough, to be fast, to put it to rest, and to support peaceful protesting. And he contacted George Floyd's family as well to give condolences. The thing that he did wrong was to decline to denounce white supremacists during the debates, and that wasn't a good look for him. Moving on to category number 6, healthcare, starting with President Trump's administration took steps to address prescription drug prices, which included proposing to increase price transparency, facilitating the importance of lower cost drugs from other countries, and eliminate certain rebates within the pharmaceutical supply chain industry. During the COVID-19 pandemic, prompted the Trump administration to temporarily expand telehealth services to increase access to health care while minimizing in-person contact. Association health plans and health disbursement arrangements. The Trump administration worked to expand the availability of the association health plans, AHP, and the Health Reimbursement Arrangement, HRAs, as an alternative for small businesses to provide health coverage to employees. Moving on to President Joe Biden, which inherited the COVID-19 pandemic and also inherited the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. And his response to the pandemic, his administration had the priority to address the pandemic by acquiring enough vaccines, increase testing, implement public health measurements to minimize the spread of the COVID-19 virus. He also expressed strong support for the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, and sought to strengthen and expand it, and then also drug pricing incentives. The Biden administration took steps to address prescription drug prices. This included supporting and legislation to allow the negotiations of drug prices by Medicare and prompting policies to increase transparency in drug prices. Moving on to category number 7, education improvement. starting with President Joe Biden. First, the American Rescue Plan for Education. This fund was intended to help schools reopen safely, address the digital divide, and mitigate the impact of the pandemic on students and educators. Joe Biden expressed the promise of making community college tuition free for eligible students. Title I funding increasing. The Biden administration has allocated for the increased funds of Title I schools, which service a high percentage of students from low-income families. The expansion of the Pell Grant. The administration has promised to expand the Pell Grant to make higher education more affordable for low-income students. Now I'm going to get into this as a college student that started back in 2018 and just graduated with my bachelor's degree the summer of 2023. First of all, the community colleges are already free for eligible students anyways. The increase of funding for Title I schools to serve high percentage of low-income families, that to me is a win. And then the expansion of the Pell Grant, I personally did not see any increase from 2018 to all the way through the pandemic. So I think that's, you can take as you will, but me as a college student, I literally saw the idea of Joe Biden being tuition free or student loans dropping. That to me is a win, but it's also a loss because it's also the responsibility of the students not to take these classes lightly, not to take their careers lightly. And if they chose a career or degree that doesn't have any real world jobs, that was their fault. And also the fault of the school itself for providing degrees that don't have a job behind it. And it's also the fault of the advisors for promoting these degrees that have no real career opportunity to them to begin with. Now for President Trump's administration aimed to expand options for parents and students beyond traditional public schools, calling it school choice. Also, STEM education efforts were made to increase funding support for STEM programs to prepare students for careers in these fields. Student loan reform. The Trump administration took steps to reform the student loan system. This includes changes to income-driven repayment plans, proposals for simplifying and consolidating federal student loan programs. Here's another perspective from a college student. A lot of my college student friends took out $50,000 loans because Joe Biden was saying that, oh, we're going to do tuition forgiveness where you don't even need to do that. And they used that so they could stay in as a student without a part-time job. Like I had a job all the way through school. And that really made me not feel that nice and happy when in fact they got their loans forgiven. $50,000 was the highest that I heard of, and really they did that as a way to play the system. And that's where I'm like, there's has to be some sort of monitoring this as well. Moving on to category number 8, infrastructure development, starting with President Trump. President Trump proposed a $1.5 trillion infrastructure investment plan. The plan aimed to leverage both federal funds and private investment to address a wide range of infrastructure programs, including transportation, water system, broadband, and energy. Executive actions and regulation reform. The Trump administration took steps to streamline regulation process and reduce permitting and timelines for infrastructure projects. The goal was to expedite the approval process and complete the projects by cutting through bureaucratic red tape. Focus on traditional infrastructure. Trump emphasized traditional infrastructure sectors such as roads, bridges, highways, airports, and waterways, transportation infrastructure, water and energy infrastructure, renewable energy projects. Now for President Joe Biden, the American Jobs Plan aimed to invest approximately $2.3 trillion over 8 years in a range of infrastructure sectors, including transportation, water, energy, and broadband. Electric vehicle infrastructure, care infrastructure for children, workforce development. The plan emphasized workforce development by investing in training and education programs to create job opportunities in infrastructure sectors. It aims to promote the development of skilled workforce capable of contributing to the construction and maintenance of infrastructure programs. The last category is collaboration with Congress for bipartisan solutions. This one is very complex and has many nuances in it because President Trump is a Republican and Congress can be filled with Democrats. President Joe Biden is a Democrat and Senate can be filled with Republicans. So they need to make a deal. They need to create a solution, a win-win for both parties instead of looking at what is best for America right now. And it's also the president is the leader, the figurehead for this country, and it's really Congress makes the laws and then he signs it as well. But it's really a vote, it's democratic. Really, the president has to show strength. So if the Congress has something that he disagrees on, he does vetoes, but also it's like you have to show strength with Congress itself to show, okay, I'm not going to be a pushover. It becomes very hard to create deals. That's why you have to do bipartisan agreements. Now for President Trump. President Trump, one noticeable bipartisan achievement during Trump's presidency was the passage of the Tax Cuts and Job Acts in December 2017, lowering corporate tax rate and providing tax relief for individuals. Criminal Justice Reform First Step Act in December 2018. This criminal justice reform legislation aimed to address issues such as mandatory minimum sentencing, prison conditions, and re-entry programs. This bill received support from both Republicans and Democrats. The COVID-19 relief package throughout COVID pandemic, Congress passed several relief packages to address the economic impact of the crisis. Infrastructure proposal, the $1.5 trillion infrastructure investment plan we already went over. Now to move over to President Joe Biden, which is going over the 9 categories that we have. The American Rescue Plan for Education was bipartisan. American Job Plan was bipartisan. And it's also, we're getting into what I talked about, which is you have to show strength, and sometimes it's arguing with the party, which was President Joe Biden arguing with Congress, which was controlled by the Republicans at that point, about the budget plan. And Congress was really about to shut down, and they had to negotiate. They had went back and forth, made compromises, and they finally agreed on a spending and budget for the federal government to avoid a government shutdown. I know I kind of inserted my opinions and feelings on each of those, but I'm going to go over the 9 and say which one I believe won that category. Starting with leadership. I believe President Trump won simply because he actually was in office longer than President Biden. With President Biden taking a 958 days, and this tracker was actually from September 2023, so it could probably be higher, compared to all of President Trump's vacation days, which was 380 days for his entire presidency. So I believe that a leader should be in office, should be prepared. Yes, he can take rest days, but taking half your job off? I've never heard of a job that wouldn't fire you for being that. So President Trump won the category of leadership. Moving on to economic stability. President Trump won this one, shadow of doubt. And you can say, oh, President Joe Biden had to deal with COVID-19. President Trump had to deal with that for his last term, and he still did quite well versus President Joe Biden that raised the gas prices, almost doubled it based off of his legislation, and also cutting off pipelines. You can't really talk about the Ukraine and Russia war because that was even Russia said we only do contribute to 6% of the global gas prices. So it was President Biden's neglect and focus on electric vehicles that caused the gas prices to skyrocket so much that I have to give the win to President Trump. Moving on to national security. Again, this is President Trump wins because he focuses and stresses national security versus President Biden that is talking more about Ukraine, another country, than his own country, more concerned about Ukraine than the border, that even Texas is fed up with it. So just that alone, President Trump wins. Next is diplomatic and international relations. President Trump was facing both President Putin, Kim Jong-un, and China all at the same time, and it was a boiling point with all three of those, and he was able to not have a war in any three of those type of things. So I think President Trump wins it by based off of that versus President Biden withdrawing and causing the Taliban to invade and take over the region there in Afghanistan. So that's really what happened. Now for social justice, and the winner is President Joe Biden. Because of his executive orders, because of his appointments, he is trying to make the federal government more diverse, more inclusive, and also the reason why he wins that is for President Trump to decline to declare that white supremacists is bad is kind of not a good look, and it's also not going to solve the popular vote. President Joe Biden also social justice of let's remove the loans from the students, even though it's against his power to do that. It has to be Congress that does it. He's still pushing for that, which yes, it is trying to be buying votes, but it's still what the population really wants right now. Now moving on to healthcare, and this might be controversial, but I will give the win to President Trump because during the time of COVID, they had experts on CNN, Fox, all over news saying that if President Trump does everything right, it'd be 400,000 deaths with COVID, and he hit that mark. And you have President Joe Biden that almost has doubled the deaths of President Trump. And President Trump had to deal with the unknown versus President Biden had the vaccine, had much of the stuff already mapped out. So really that 770 deaths for Joe Biden made him not that good, and him blaming, oh, the unvax. Really, it's he did not have a good policy for it. Moving on to education improvement, President Joe Biden wins it hands down because he's trying to offer student loan forgiveness to all the students. Like I said, as a college student now, my classmates were racking up student loan debt just because President Biden kept on saying, oh, student loan forgiveness. So they were thinking free money. So that's where education improvement, President Joe Biden wins it. hands down, even though President Trump was very much had many different plans as well. Now on for infrastructure development, I'll give the win to President Biden because his infrastructure bill was larger than President Trump's bill. However, you can argue for and against President Trump with the trying to cut regulation, bureaucracy, red tape that things have, things can be developed faster, but without oversight, without double checking everything, we potentially will have bridges and roads collapsing in the next couple of years because of poor development in infrastructure. Then moving on to collaborations with Congress for bipartisan solutions. I'm giving the win to President Trump because of his tax cuts for corporations and individuals and his bill on criminal justice reform. And he also did the COVID-19 relief packages. Really, those things are very big, needed both parties to do it. President Joe Biden really during the budgeting negotiations had no cards, and he wasn't willing to deal for the first few days of that. It really showed to me that he wasn't really willing to negotiate and be bipartisan. So that's why President Trump wins that battle too. And if you want to go on percentages, this is a 67% win for President Trump. Now, I'm going to compare the big things that will affect this election for both President Trump and President Biden. Starting with President Biden, it is his age. He is 81 years old, and he would be the oldest president in office. Comparing him to President Trump is 77 years old. However, it's how they both act mentally and physically. You can say President Trump actually looks better than President Joe Biden. President Joe Biden on stage or walking really looks like he's walking on ice or something like that, and it really doesn't show right. And there have been many clips where he doesn't really understand questions, citing back to when he was talking with children, and the children asked, "What was the last country you were in?" And he did not know how to answer that, to the fact that a child said, "Oh, you were in Ireland." And he responded, "How did you know that?" He was shocked that someone would know that. So it was more or less the first hurdle for President Biden will be how he looks to the voters' minds. Next is the impeachment inquiry, paying attention to how his family has been paid from foreign sources such as China, Kazakhstan, Romania, Russia, and Ukraine between 2014 and 2019, and he was focusing when he was vice president in Ukraine and has been cited saying that if you don't get this prosecutor fired, I'm going to withhold money, directly help Hunter Biden and his company do more business. Next is President Biden's son, who, if you listen to on the news, they talk about him as if he was a teenager, when in fact he is 53 years old. He's a grown man, has had many different issues, mainly because of his family's business dealings in Russia, Ukraine, and China, to the point that James Comer claims the emails text shows Joe Biden was aware of Hunter Biden's businesses in those countries. Also claims that these business ties influence President Biden's policies, choices towards China, but it is unclear how. Emails also discuss setting aside a certain percentage of a deal for the big guy, which if you listen to the right-wing podcast, they'll say, "Oh, it's President Biden's getting bribed." There hasn't been proof of that cemented yet, and we'll see in the future. Other sites of bribery and access to the White House was Kevin Morris paying $5 million to Hunter Biden for helping the campaign. with the goal of getting access to the Biden White House. Devin Archer, which was a longtime business partner, testimony, which Hunter Biden would have many frequent calls with President Biden during business dealings, citing more than 50 occurrences of that. And when the press secretary said, oh, it was just pleasantries, talking about the weather, that type of thing. But really, if you're a businessman, why are you calling your father just to talk about the weather? It's really about showing, oh, you have access to the White House, to foreign businesses. And to summarize that, it's really the problem with President Joe Biden is his age, his son doing foreign business dealings, and also the impeachment inquiry right now. Moving on to President Trump. The New York State hush money case with Stormy Daniels kind of already got settled, which is, during his campaign, they paid Stormy Daniels to not say, you had an affair with President Trump. If you look at the history of President Trump, he's had affairs before. He was a womanizer. It is known that he's that way. The next case is the federal classified document case where the FBI went into Mar-a-Lago to take classified documents from President Trump. Really looks bad, but the fact that President Biden, President Obama, they both have been cited with having classified documents after being president. So this is really not a case at all where President Biden had classified documents in his garage, which is not a secure environment. The next one is the federal election interference case, which was the January 6th case. This whole podcast was created by me looking up and researching stuff, and this is my opinion only. I did not get paid by President Trump or his campaign. I did not get paid by President Joe Biden or his campaign to create this one, and this is not designed to be an endorsement for or against either candidate. It was just stating some facts. Please follow my podcast, and thank you for listening to the Dorian Finance Podcast.